and they refused help. And they've refused help for 25 years. So that's been a passion of mine to get the police to do their job, frankly.
I think one of the reasons I became a journalist was to get the media to do their jobs. Well, have they been doing their jobs? And I must say the Ramsey case to me is a glimpse into the soul, the heart and soul of America. How we deal with this case, how we recognize or fail to recognize the reality of this case, I think speaks to this idea of failing to recognize the reality of America itself and even our own realities. Think about it. Since the popular Netflix series came out almost a month ago, there's been nary a dissenting voice, and John Ramsey has emerged this year more than ever as the hero of his own story. Is he? Is John Ramsey a hero?
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. By the way, if you've been following my coverage of the Ramsey case, do you think there's anything authentic about it, or would you say it's actually really not authentic? There's nothing authentic about it. What would you say? Do you think that my coverage of the Ramsey case proves or shows or supports this idea of authenticity, or not really? Have you ever thought of it that way? Does this channel stand out in any way? Other channels either not covering this case at all, which I think is quite inauthentic in and of itself, given how much is going on, or those who are covering it, are they covering it with courage and kind of a genuine pursuit of the truth, or is it pandering? Because it looks like there's a lot of pandering taking place in the media. Do you agree with that? And in this analysis, we're going to look at really that side of it. Two very rare exceptions, two very rare voices that are basically thinking critically about this whole narrative. I mean, a lot of us are, but what about the media? I'm not saying it's easy to do because it's legally something of a minefield, but I do think it's important to do. And think about this question, is John Ramsey a hero? And I think who we choose or who we elect as heroes says something about us as well. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Bear in mind, I will be following this analysis with our whole attempt to hold all the aces, and there's one missing. It's the ace of diamonds. It's the who of this case, so look out for that. If you can't wait for that particular analysis, I have posted the script on Patreon, so you can head there if you would like to read it immediately. Go to patreon.com/TCRS. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please hit the like button and let's get started. Is John Ramsey a hero? Do you think of him as a hero? I think that depends on a few things. He will say, and the media will repeat, that it all depends on foreign DNA and only on foreign DNA. I would say it also depends on who wrote the ransom note. I'm saying whether John is a hero. And also whether the sexual element in the Ramsey case was a once-off or systemic. Whether the fibers on the inside of the duct tape belong to Patsy or an intruder, and a host of other issues. In other words, John's heroism is contingent on his innocence, isn't it? Now, the media are happy to ignore these nuances in their single-minded support of their cash cow interview. But you know, there have been one or two surprising exceptions, and we're going to go through them, first the one, then the other. I've already touched briefly on the Denver Gazette article, Netflix docuseries reignites JONBENET Ramsey case, but no definitive answers. But the critical part here is Carol McKinley found some critical evidence omitted from the popular series. And what's particularly impressive with Carol McKinley, who herself appeared in the Netflix series, is instead of just surfing that wave, she writes an article with a respectable amount of critical thinking, asking the pertinent question, who and what did the series leave out? As far as I know, Carol McKinley was also the producer of The List, which is something that is very supportive, in my view, of Lou Smith. Now, one thing McKinley countered was Smith's assertion that JONBENET's bed sheets appeared clean on photos, whereas McKinley's sources, with apparent support from Police Chief Mark Beckner, was that her urine-soaked sheets were so pungent the ammonia would, quote, knock you out. In other words, Netflix said there was no urine in JONBENET's bed, and the Denver Gazette questioned if that was accurate. And I think that is valid, because I think you could easily say, well, there was no bedwetting that night, so the whole bedwetting narrative is overblown. I don't think it is. I do think Steve Thomas went completely overboard with it, but in a way for some of the right reasons. The whole bedwetting narrative is easy to overemphasize or dismiss for that matter, but it's possible we're so distracted by it that we're missing a more important narrative that has to do not with urine but excrement. And of course, alongside that narrative is a narrative I have not touched on virtually at all, the SA side of things. If the SA was a once-off and occurred on the night of JONBENET's death, and only then it militates towards a one-off intruder, and then you do have a situation where it appears John Ramsey is innocent and he is the hero of the story. On the other hand, if the SA was systemic and had been going on for a while, and what that implies is inside that house for a while, well then, when the grand jury voted to indict on a word starting with A that sounds like obtuse, well, that was all about allowing their daughter to be placed. That indictment was all about allowing their daughter to be placed in a situation for an ongoing period. Doesn't this suggest the grand jury may have suspected or believed the obtuse with an A was systemic? It's a very important question. It's a critical question. If so, if it was systemic, then that seems to preclude a stranger intruder. And that then brings us to the coverage of Washington Times reporter and Brooklyn Law alumni Nicholas Cameras. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right. You can follow him on X at NickBKNYUSA, and you can follow me at Crime Rocket. And that brings us to 5 important insights from the Washington Times. Number 1, good cop, bad cop.
Seem to have been cleaning house lately. The Citizens Review Board recommended termination of 5 of their detectives for poor investigative techniques, performance. One of which was the guy that was our detective. He was more of a roadblock than a helper. And they brought in a new chief from outside the system, which was huge in our book. So we're hoping the new chief will change the culture and accept help. Lots of help has been offered.
Now, in this interview, seated beside John Ramsey at his left-hand side is Joe Berlinger, the person responsible for the Netflix docuseries. I have obviously encountered Berlinger before, long before he turned the Ramseys into Netflix fodder and did his filmmaking alchemy on them. It was when he turned former suspects into both victims and heroes, and doesn't he do that with this Netflix series? He tries to turn John into a victim and a hero. Berlinger did the same with the West Memphis 3. In that case, 3 little boys were murdered, and Berlinger did a fantastic job in convincing America that the poor suspects were innocent, even though one of them had confessed multiple times. He did such a good job that they were ultimately acquitted in an Alford plea, which means technically they weren't acquitted, but they do get to sort of walk the streets as free men. Anyway, decades later, the killers of those 3 8-year-old boys haven't been found. So Berlinger is great at mocking and undermining the cops, but he's a lousy investigator, in my opinion, in the sense of actually solving a case. Because think about it, the West Memphis 3 case, like the Ramsey case, is still technically unsolved. And so what you see here is someone who can break a case, who can mock the police, but he can't seem to make a case. He can't solve a case. He can't seem to figure it out. The Washington Post reiterates this sentiment as follows. Mr. Berlinger's social justice activism notwithstanding, the officers working on the JONBENET Ramsey case were guided by the evidence. This is something that he seems to overlook. And they were brave enough to ignore enormous pressure to essentially let this case disappear. And the irony is, in his docu-series, he has the district attorney saying that he was brave enough to ignore enormous pressure. And I'm not really sure if the word there is brave or stubborn or even just misguided. Or maybe it has to do with other things. It could do with certain legal things, but it could also do with garden variety, greed, and selfishness. And Vanity Fair's Anne Bardach also exposed the underlying hypocrisy of the investigation, and that doesn't quite ring the same way as it does on Netflix, does it?
And it's disturbing to me because there has been a steady stream of leaks, but if the leaks come from either the district attorney's office, where they usually do, well, then that's okay, or from the Ramsey family. But if they're suspected to come from possibly the police department, well, then the Ramsey family wants a criminal investigation in it.
Yeah. And at the time of this whole interview that she gave, as a result of the ransom note being leaked, the Boulder PD was under internal investigation. You also notice, doing a little bit of statement analysis, she says, if the leaks come from the district attorney's office where they usually do, so the district attorney is usually the one doing the leaking, right? Now, reading between the lines, and this is just an opinion, an inference, doesn't it seem as if the district attorney and the Ramseys are both leaking? And so couldn't that mean they were colluding, both cooperating, both working together? I'm just saying, doesn't that seem as though what is going on here? Isn't that one inference to potentially draw? Both colluding in order to influence the public in order to affect the same outcome. In other words, there's a sense of a pre-decided outcome, and we are going to now fill in the blanks on the road to that finish line to get ourselves to that outcome that's going to benefit us. In hindsight, doesn't it look a little bit that way? And so how does that make the Boulder police the bad guys in this story? And incidentally, some of the latest news is that John Ramsey is supposed to meet with Boulder PD. Fox News and KKTV are two more outlets that John, this is my last interview, Ramsey has given of late, pushing his media blitz this year to around 20.
The good cop, bad cop routine.
I do hope when John talks to the cops, he gives them an interview, as well. Having given 20 interviews to the media, can't he give them a little one too? I'm sure they have quite a few questions and they'd like to talk to him as well. Number 2, Ramsey's complained cops were too tough on them when they weren't tough enough. This is another excerpt from the article. Ron Walker, former FBI Denver supervisory agent, was the first federal agent on the scene. While he has said that the police made mistakes, he asserts that their primary error was not being tougher by separating and interviewing the Ramseys from the beginning.
If we're going to play games, I'm going to need a cup of coffee.
And make no mistake, the Ramsey case is indeed a lot about playing games. It started with the Ramsey ransom note, and those games are still afoot. Number 3, chronic bedwetting may not be as benign as the Ramseys want you to believe. The bedwetting is a symptom possibly of a larger story of neglect. That is also something that the indictments, what the grand jury voted on to indict, seems to allude to, seems to touch on. And so I think it raises a few questions. What also goes into neglect? Well, things like sleeping habits, bathing habits, eating habits, intervening in sibling dynamics when necessary, family dynamics, past family behavior, the whole health narrative surrounding a child. Quoting from the article, JONBENET was also a chronic bedwetter, and according to the autopsy, there were indications, I'm not going to read the next part, but that suggest she might have endured ongoing, and there you can read those words on screen. Now, if the obtuse was ongoing, and some experts believe it was, well, then you can throw out the intruder theory. The problem with this theory is that the coroner couldn't tell if it was ongoing, and the family doctor, a close friend of the Ramseys, swore that there were 0 signs in the family records, which gives you a kind of strange contradiction. It's this idea from the Ramseys that the sexual element was extremely severe, the work of like an adult pedophile, some kind of monster. And yet the reality is that it was so strangely unclear that the coroner wasn't quite sure what to make of it. And there's also a strange kind of activity that's going on here that, put it this way, it's nothing like we see in the Madeline Soto case, it's not on a scale anything like that. It's far more subtle. It's at a much milder scale than what we see there. What does that suggest?
There's someone out there.
Number 4, is there really a killer on the loose? The way Netflix turns the cops into the bad guys, I mean, no charges were ever brought against any of the Ramseys, despite a child found dead in their home. So, I mean, what are they complaining about? And so the article refers here to, with his vitriolic attacks against police officers, particularly lead detective Steve Thomas, Mr. Berlinger seems intent on exacting a perverse form of revenge against law enforcement consistent with his past criticism of the American justice system. Now, we do seem to be entering a strange phase where the police and justice are always at fault. Meanwhile, cold-blooded murderers like the CEO killer are celebrated as folk heroes. This really is an era of a sort of inversion, a sort of a twisted mindset where being accused of murder, such as happened to Amanda Knox and her pal Damien Eccles, seems to be like hitting the jackpot. And the Ramseys also seem to have made a mint out of suing a detective, network after network and tabloid after tabloid, and making piles of treasure as a result. Also, they can't seem to stop talking about it. And yet, whenever John is asked point blank, who do you think killed JONBENET, he's got a very cop-out answer. I don't know. He said that on Crime Junkie just a couple of days ago, didn't he? And what have the Ramseys done to improve investigations into child murders? If you've made this case your whole life's work, what have they done to actually improve anything? Have they worked on any specific case that required financial or legal support and helped improve the outcome or achieve a certain outcome? Where were the Ramseys when Gannon Stork disappeared in Colorado Springs, or the Watch children down the road in Frederick? And were stranger intruders involved in either of those cases? And then the final point, number 5, the unfair advantage the Ramseys had over the cops. Anne Bardak, in her interview, talks briefly about how she got hold of the ransom note.
Right.
So clearly somebody spent a considerable amount of time hanging out in the kitchen, writing and composing a ransom note right after killing this child.
How did you get it?
Well, that's the $64,000
It
question.
certainly is.
And everybody's asking me it, and I'm very distressed because there's an investigation going on in Colorado to try to find the source.
Because the prosecutor's not thrilled that it's been released. Is that
No,
correct to say or not?
They're up in arms, and
Right.
there's an internal affairs investigation going on, I am told, to try to find this. And it's disturbing to me.
Now, this is so bizarre for so many reasons, because even John Douglas recommended that the public be given the note, and any investigator with 2 brain cells would say, this is your best evidence. Have the public look at it and see if they can match the handwriting. That is a very quick way that you can identify and source the killer. Why hold that back? Well, one reason is if you don't really want to solve the case. And yet when it is released, they want actual charges against the police. Now consider how quick and effective that investigation is, and how slow and apathetic the Ramsey investigation turned out to be, this sort of lame duck lurching slowly and unsurely towards nowhere and nothing. The journalist behind this Washington Post article, who also studied law, he offers a prescient clue as to why the odds were always against the Boulder cops and with the Ramseys. He writes, for decades, the Boulder Police Department has been a scapegoat because the complexities of the case are easy to misrepresent. Now, I think in the same way that the Boulder Police Department are the scapegoat, and they really are, in another way, the ransom note was the scapegoat for what had really happened to JONBENET. It's the same psychology that's at work here. Blame someone else, direct attention to someone else. And this is the important part. He says, Colorado law prohibits investigators from revealing evidence during an ongoing criminal investigation, preventing officers from defending themselves. That's so important. And we saw exactly the same unfair playing field taking place in the McCann case, and look at what happened in that case as well. Cowardice also makes an almost perfunctory comment referring to this notion of using a slick production to distort the truth. Think about the Ramsey note as a, well, perhaps not so slick production, but certainly a production to distort the truth. And I touched on that in my lengthy analysis on the ransom note. Cowardice writes, Joe Berlinger's new Netflix documentary on the killing of JONBENET Ramsey is sure to become a favorite of villains eager to learn how to use slick production to distort the truth. And this is definitely something that is of concern, that the bad guys might actually look at this and find a way, oh, this is how you can turn straw into gold. This is how you can reinvent a narrative. And we're seeing quite a lot of that going on now. We also seeing Amanda Knox taking charge of her story, actually executively producing a docuseries that's all about validating herself, all about turning herself into the hero of her own story. Cowardice goes on to write, the narrative is shameless propaganda and meretricious fiction. If you don't know what meretricious is, have a look up that word in the dictionary. Meretricious fiction designed to smear honest police officers who took on the Colorado establishment to get justice for a slain little girl. What is wrong with that? Trying to get justice for a little girl. What is wrong with that kind of pursuit? And then you have John Ramsey saying the real story isn't what happened to her, it's what happened to us. No, it's not. In a forthcoming episode, I want to take that analysis further. What other distortions are there beyond the ransom note and the media narrative? And we'll examine those via the Ramsey's very tricksy photographic narrative surrounding this case. Thank you for listening, especially if you've listened to this far. Thank you so much. Take care, and I'll see you guys next time.